Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to the True Life Podcast. Hope everybody's having a beautiful day or evening or lunch or wherever you are. I hope that the world is smiling upon you. I hope you realize there's a little miracle about to happen for you. I don't know what it is, but I bet you there's something good about to come your way. One thing that might be coming your way is this great show with an incredible guest I have right here, the one and only Alex McNab-Lundbäck. As a seasoned navigator in the realms of communication, media relations, and personal branding. His journey from Downing Street to McNab-Lundbäck Communications speaks volumes. Your commitment to helping tech CEOs and leaders transition from subject matter experts to thought leaders is truly commendable. Navigating the challenges faced by CEOs and founders, you understand the struggle of moving beyond titles, the uncertainty in content creation, and the fear of going unnoticed. Your 15 plus years of experience spanning diverse organizations showcase a wealth of expertise in overcoming these hurdles. Your tailored services, designed to boost confidence in storytelling, strategically position leaders as thought leaders, and leverage existing resources, demonstrate a thoughtful and effective approach. Your emphasis on organic growth, authentic communication, and engagement resonates with the essence of building true authority. Whether it's collaboration, coaching, or addressing specific communication needs, your guiding hand promises to elevate profiles from mere names and titles to impactful thought leaders. I hope everyone is ready to embark on this transformative journey. Alex, thank you for being here today.
Thank you so much, and thanks for that introduction. It was kind of certainly better than I could probably introduce myself, and sums up everything that I've been wanting to say. So it is my pleasure to be here.
Wow. First off, I'm stoked you're here, and it's we're crossing a pretty big time gap over here, but I think it's relevant. I think that the same way we can use this technology to bridge this gap in geography, we're bridging a gap in authenticity and leadership, and that's kind of what you're all about, man. Maybe you can give us a little bit of a backstory about how you got here today and what you're working on.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I mean, what was really interesting is that as you were doing your introduction, and I know that I also have it a lot in my marketing material, is that word thought leader. And I know that I hope that we'll talk a little bit more about that, because kind of as I think more, I actually start to hate that term more. But I'm going to go into that. I'm going to go into a little bit later. But essentially, what I actually have always been about, or what I've always been passionate about, is leadership communications. And I think that when I started in communications generally, that was always something that I had kind of on my mind as something that I was just fascinated about. How we communicate, how leaders communicate, how we can communicate messages. And I've kind of done it a bit of everything, right? So I've done commercial PR, and I've done leadership communications. I've done video production. I've done content production. I've been a journalist. So in a way, I've kind of tried it all to figure out kind of where I slot in, which is what we're always trying to do, right? Like, where do we fit in this world of ours? And I've kind of settled on leadership communications, and I'm going to keep and more use that term leadership communications rather than subject matter experts to thought leadership, because it sounds good, but I'm kind of, the more I said it, the more I questioned it myself about this concept of thought leadership. So, but that's kind of a little bit about kind of where I'm coming from. But it is about leadership communications. It's about but it's not just about leadership communications, because it's actually about how we all communicate. Yeah. And then that kind of takes a little bit of a spin of kind of like, right, so are we all leaders in our own right? We might only be leading our families. We may only be leading our partners. We may only be leading our friends or our social circles, but we are all leaders at heart, which means that we are all communicators at heart. We are all storytellers at heart. And if we can improve those skills, then we'll become better leaders, better friends, better partners, better people. And that's really, I think, that what I'm starting to narrow down even further. Like, I started off by doing this subject matter experts into thought leaders. I was fascinated by thought leadership. I still am, because I think that the kind of what it actually is, and what people maybe think it is actually something different to what it actually is, in certainly in my mind. So I think that that's really fascinating. And so I kind of caught upon that. But really what I'm about, is about getting people and helping people to communicate better. Because It is. I strongly believe that it is the one skill that if you can communicate better, if you can communicate well, then so much of your life is improved. Your relationships are improved. Your careers can be improved because you're better at interviews or you're better at communicating your messaging. You have better relationship with people at work because you're communicating your ideas, and maybe some of those innovative ideas are getting implemented at work, which makes you feel better about yourself, which gives you more positioning. Maybe it gets you that promotion. Likewise, if you can communicate better, just when you're at the supermarket, you feel better about yourself. You feel more confident about yourself. So if we improve our communication skills, then actually everything else in our lives can also improve. And I like that is a hugely powerful skill to have, right?
Yeah, I couldn't agree anymore. Is what we're communicating meaning? Are we communicating meaning to people? Is that the thing that we're passing between us and what makes our lives better, whether it's internal dialogue or whether it's a relationship? What's the relationship to meaning?
It is meaning, but it's also about making connections, which I guess is also connected with meaning. So I think you're right. You could sort of say, well, what is it that we're communicating? And I guess that's the kind of the second stage. But I do think it's about making connections. And I think that that's what really great communication does, right? When you hear an amazingly powerful speech, you believe that it's powerful because you are making a connection with that speaker. When you are listening to a partner or you're listening to your family and they're communicating to you in a way that resonates with you, that makes you feel something, makes you feel an emotion, gives you that dose of dopamine, gives you a sense of emotion. All of that is because ultimately what it's about is that you are making a connection. And that's what also great communication makes. So by communicating with meaning, by communicating your messages more succinctly, more clearly, with more gravitas, you are making stronger connections. And that is really what life is about. That is what society is about. It's about making connections and about making actually meaningful connections. You can make connections all the time, but it's about making meaningful connections.
Yeah, I love it. It seems to me maybe this could be paired with like neurofeedback. Like maybe if you could see what was happening in the brain as you're making that connection. Is that too far out there? Like that might be a good strategy.
I don't think it is, because I think that is what it's all connected, right? Because actually, if you take, when I asked you a little bit about kind of like, what are the angles of this conversation? What are we going to be talking about? And you kind of mentioned philosophy, and I think that then you start talking about kind of like what is good communication actually doing, and that's when you start bringing in the science to it. Like it's giving us a dose of endorphins, it is giving us a dopamine injection. Like basically we're all just drug addicts, and that's what we're seeking, right? That is what we're seeking. We're seeking that next injection of some kind of neurological drug that is going to make us feel something. It's going to make us feel happy, it's going to make us feel sad, it's going to make a connection, it's going to mean something to us. And that's actually kind of what we're constantly searching is for that, for those messages, for those stories, and for building those connections that actually mean something to us, which will give us, maybe it's a dopamine hit, or maybe it's an emotional hit, or maybe it's something else. So I think you're right. If we could see something, we were kind of constantly connected to a mind map to see, and they have done those kind of studies in terms of injections of dopamine and serotonin and all those things and what that actually means. But taking the science out of it, really, it's about emotions, and it's about how communication and how different forms of communication and how stories and how making connections make us feel and how they build on our emotions.
Yeah, there's a great quote that says, people may forget what you say, they may forget what you do, but they'll never forget how you made them feel. And like that seems to be the foundation of communication. And, I think it's Carl Jung who talks about everyone is a mirror in some way, or a reflection of you. And when you can begin to see the negative things in people and realize, hey, that's a negative thing in me, I recognize that, or that's a positive thing. I want that to come out in me. Like, this idea of empathy maybe has a relationship to connection, and this idea of people as mirrors as a connection. What do you think?
Yeah, hugely, and actually, so much of communication skills is also about psychology. So, when we learn, or when we hear about what good public speaking is, a lot of it is mirroring. Like, so
Yeah.
it's kind of like we feel empathy when we start mirroring maybe the way that people speak, or the way that what people are doing. If someone is feeling very closed in, if we start also getting very close and closed in too, that makes us feel warmer. That makes us feel like we're making connections. It's making us feel like we're making a stronger connection, because that person is taking an acknowledgement in how that person's talking, how that person's feeling, how their body language is. So when we do mirror those reactions, when we mirror someone's way of speaking, who was it who said that, imitation is the greatest form of flattery? Well, it's absolutely true. We feel a greater connection when somebody is imitating us in sometimes, minute, slight ways, but it's that imitation that builds that connection.
Do you not like thought leader because it sounds like it's condescending in some ways? Like, this person's a thought leader.
Let's go into why I hate thought leaders.
Okay, let's do it.
Let's dive right into that. Listen, as anybody will see, and everybody will go on my LinkedIn, and everybody will see my webpage, and I talk about thought leaders a lot because I caught on to this subject matter expert into thought leader. And then I actually started thinking about what that really meant. And really, it was about improving communication skills. And the reason why I don't like thought leader is because it has been given this gravitas. It has been given this pedestal. It has been given this high and mighty, you can become a thought leader. I say it myself, right? You can become a thought leader. And I really started kind of looking at it and going, what is it? Actually, what is a thought leader? Like, what does it mean to be a thought leader? Now, you can break it down and you can start talking about what it means leading in thought. Cool. Yeah, that makes sense. But how do you go about that? How do you start going leading in thought? And do you just become, I look at people who we regard as thought leaders and ask myself, like, are they really a thought leader, and why? And there are some people, I don't know whether this is the avenue for me to name names of the thought leaders who I don't really believe are thought leaders, but there are some people, let's say, who have made a name for themselves because they had a thought, or more actually accurately, they communicated a thought that was already out there. Because a lot of thought leaders, i.e. thought leader celebrities nowadays, they haven't actually had anything new to say, but they have had a platform to say it. So they have kind of brought to the forefront something that has been said before, but then it gets attributed to them. The problem with that is that then they see themselves as high and mighty thought leaders, which means that every time they have a thought, suddenly they're inspirational. Suddenly they are put on this pedestal again because they've communicated a thought they had. Well, what if we could all do that, right?
Yeah.
Wouldn't that be amazing? I don't know. I'm not sure whether I can be swearing on this podcast.
Yeah,
I'm trying to contain,
of course.
Kind of constrain my language a little bit. But why can't we all do that? Like, and if we can, like, is that a good thing or a bad thing? Like, and maybe our thought isn't really that meaningful. That also may be fine. But that's kind of what I don't like, is that these thought leadership celebrities, to give them a title that I can't think of something else, is actually probably what I hate. So, and as a result, like, we don't talk about them about like celebrity thought leaders. We just talk about them being thought leaders. And what I don't like is this, that, they are experienced, they are subject matter experts in one thing, but then they become a thought leader, and suddenly they are a subject matter expert in everything. And we can't be thought leaders in everything. And that's the issue that I have with, maybe that is the issue that I have in thought leadership. So
yeah,
there are two sides to it. One is the fact that if we actually go down to the organic definition of what a thought leader is, then I don't think that we should all try and become a thought leader, and I don't think that, because of the ways that I've just mentioned. But I also question whether thought leadership is really the title at all that we should be. Maybe we don't really need a title. Maybe it is just about, you know what, we can all be going out there and we can all be communicating better. And if that is because you want to advance your career, if that is because you want to advance your relationships, if that's because you want to appear more confident and more charismatic to your friends and to your family, cool. If that's because you want to do a TEDx talk or a TED talk even, that's also fine.
Yeah.
But like, kind of know your reason for becoming a thought leader, and actually then just stripping away that title of grandiose and actually say, what I really want to do is communicate better. And some of that will be communicating innovation, will be communicating something that's interesting, communicating a story. But that doesn't necessarily make me a thought leader. That just makes me a great communicator. And that's like, there's no problem with that. Like, I think that's a great thing. I think we can all be better communicators, or we all should be aspiring to be better storytellers and better communicators. But we don't need to or should aspire to becoming a thought leader per se.
Yeah, that's really well said. I admire the breakdown of it. And after I hear you talk about it, yeah, thought's pretty vague. Like, thought can mean anything. You know, you could be, if you're a thought leader, does that mean all your thoughts? You're the leader in all your thoughts, you know? And
exactly. Like, if I have a thought now, and I'm like, if I know what,
he's a thought leader.
I think I'm going to go and get another coffee. Now I might communicate that to my wife, and my wife will say, that sounds like a great idea. I'm going to go and have a coffee too. Am I then a thought leader because I have led that person in thought? You know, and so that's why when you really break it down as to what a thought leader is, leading in thought, leading with thought, what does that actually mean? You know, does it have to be an inspirational, wow, that's amazing, this is breakthrough type thoughts? Or actually, can it be, you know, I've got a thought, I've got a viewpoint on this, and I'm going to communicate it in this way. And I'm going to do that through great storytelling, or I'm going to do that through charisma, or I'm going to do that through better communication skills. And that's what thought leadership is. That person may, when you do that, you don't need to have, you know, 50 billion followers or whatever it is that you're aspiring to become a thought leader, but you are communicating your thoughts and your messages and your stories that are forming connections, and because you're communicating them in a meaningful way. And that, maybe that's what a thought leader is, in which case we could all become thought leaders, but we've got to change the definition of that. You know, if I go out there and sort of say, hey, we can all be thought leaders, people will sort of say, you're a fucking idiot. Like, no one's going to, like, we can't all have 2 billion followers. We can't all do this. We can't all have a TEDx platform. We can't all do this. And I'll say, yeah, you're right. But that doesn't make us any less a thought leader. If we are communicating a strong message in a meaningful way that's forming connections by telling stories.
Yeah, in some ways, it makes me start thinking that it sounds so Bernaysian. Like, maybe the idea of a thought leader is something that's given to us so that we model our reality in a certain way. You know what I mean by that? Like, a thought leader is someone that is told, hey, this person's a thought leader. Oh, we should follow them. In some ways, the idea of a leader means we need someone to think for us. You know what I mean? Like, in some ways, it's like, oh, I see what's happening. Here is a mask someone puts on so that everyone follows them around. But then the real guy's probably pulling the strings, especially when it comes to celebrities, right? The emptiest barrel makes the loudest sound, man. Some of those barrels are pretty empty.
I think there's a good part of that. I think that societally, I think that we, maybe psychologically, we do love celebrity. Of course we do. Like, you know, that's how all of these reality TV shows, these celebrity programs, why TMZ or whatever it is, all of these channels that talk about celebrities and what they have for breakfast, we actually care. Maybe a thought leader in the traditional sense of the definition, not sort of a newfound definition of it, but in the traditional sense of the definition, maybe thought leader is just what? I don't know, like an intelligent celebrity, a corporate celebrity in that sense. Like, if we think about the people that we think of thought leaders, right? And some of them are. So I'm not putting them all in the same category here, but we think of people like Simon Sinek, of course, and I have my own views on him, but people like Richard Branson, people maybe even like Bill Gates, like the people that we see
Yeah.
quoted, people we see
Right.
with a fancy background and a quote. Actually, they are corporate celebrities in their own right, but
Well
because
said.
they say something like, "Oh, that is really profound," even if it's actually not that profound, but we assume it is because they are a corporate celebrity, if you will.
Yeah.
And I think that's really interesting about, again, like going back to the title that we bestow
Yeah.
on who we think are a thought leader. Whereas, I see plenty of people on LinkedIn, for example, where they have maybe 1,000 or a couple of thousand, maybe even less than that, but they'll come out with something which is a fantastic story and it means something and they have a message to it, and I instantly feel a connection with them because they have told a message and they've told a story in a particular way and something that they've lived and they've put out there into the world. Now, you could say that they are a thought leader. They are communicating a thought and they have led in thought because it's made someone think in some way, shape, or form. But we will never bestow the title of thought leader on them because they don't have millions of followers and they haven't appeared on Diary of a CEO and they haven't got a TEDx talk. And, that is what we regard as someone who is a thought leader. But actually, there is a thought leader in all of us. And again, that kind of sounds shitty and marketing, but actually, when you that is what I'm all about. Like, we are all inherently great storytellers.
Yep.
We should be, since we've been sat around the goddamn campfires, we've been
Yep.
telling stories to each other. We all have innate storytellers in us, and actually that's what I believe a thought leader should be aspiring to, telling stories but communicating a message with meaning and making connections through the telling of those stories. And that's what a thought leader should be. So when I go out there and say, what, I think we can all be thought leaders, and people will sort of say, "Wow, that's bullshit." Like, we can't all have a TEDx talk and we can't all appear on Stephen Bartlett. That's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is that we can all tell better stories. We can all tell stories better. We can all communicate more meaning in our lives, and to the ones that mean something to us, and we can all form better connections.
Yeah.
And that, to me, is probably what being a thought leader actually is. And the reason, and sort of just to conclude, the reason why I started and why maybe I'm going to start moving away from using the term thought leader is because of this misinterpretation of what thought leadership actually is, and so instead kind of bring it back into kind of like, well, what do I actually do? And that is, and what do I actually want to do? And that is to help people communicate better, to give people more confidence, to allow people to communicate their thoughts, their message, their career, their stories in a better, more meaningful way that makes stronger connections. That's what I'm really about. And, I think that's something that I've come, the moment I started using the word thought leadership more and more, I realized how much I hated it. And so now I'm in this kind of this crossroads where, okay, cool, I'm going to start changing my marketing material, but also I actually want to start talking to people like yourself about why I'm not going to be using that term going forward and what I actually believe about this term, thought leadership. And also because I think it's actually a term that's going to become redundant very, very soon. Like all of these things, there are certain terms that we all kind of jumped on the bandwagon of, and then 2 years down the line, no one's using it, or they just think it's, old fashioned. Like, we've even stopped using influencers now. We're content creators. Well, isn't it the same fucking thing? But like, so then you're like, well, what is an influencer anymore? Do we not like influencer because it's got this bad reputation? And maybe thought leadership is going to be like that. Like, we are going to start sort of saying, oh, like, it's not right to be seen as a thought leader. The same way that now we kind of have this negative interpretation when we hear the word influencer. So we've started calling them content creators instead, because that just sounds a little bit more higher brow. But actually, they're doing the same thing, right? They're creating content to get awareness, to inspire people, to influence people when they're doing it via branding deals and everything else. So it doesn't change the fact that they are influencers just because they're calling them content creators now. Like, it just sounds a bit better, I think.
Yeah, I like it. It brings to a question to my mind that, when we begin changing the words we use, I think we we change the way we model reality. I think a lot of like the subject object relationship. And in that, if it's sentence structure, at least in the English language, but in the sentence structure, we have this subject object relationship. And, it's really a very linear way to see people or relationships. This is a subject and an object. It's so, on some level, it frustrates me because it's mechanical in nature. It's like you're a subject, you're an object, but no, I'm a human being, damn it. I have all kinds of dimensions to me. I have all kinds of weird angles and like different things but when we find ourselves stuck in this subject object relationship, it's really hard to have an original thought. It's really hard to see things from this perspective or this different angle. But maybe that's what's happening. Maybe we're shifting gears from it just being a subject-object relationship and there being another avenue into this. And that's why we're changing from influencer to content creator, because we're shifting our focus in the way we use our language. What do you think? Is that too abstract?
No, I don't think it is too abstract. I think that's probably true to a certain extent. I think that people like things, they like it to be kept simple. Like, it's like, and that, yeah. But I think that is why we give titles on something. Like when we hear the word celebrity, let's go back to that. Like when we hear the word celebrity, we instantly know what that means.
Yep.
Like we don't have to sort of say, instead of saying celebrity, we could say someone who has a TV show that got at least 1 million viewers, someone who is recognized in the street. But we don't. We have to give them a title. And I think that's a little bit like thought leader. Like, now it is like this kind of corporate influencer or this famous intellectual, but we have to give them some kind of title. So at the moment, that's thought leader. Mm-hmm. Further down the line, maybe we'll think of a different term for it. So I think that's what it's really about. It's about giving a title on something. And then that is, as you say, like that is the problem with that, is because it actually oversimplifies things, and you say you have that sort of subject object, that's, I always think of that when we go back to companies, right? So when we think about companies, one thing I really hate. So this is, I'm going to start by saying this is a bugbear, because one thing I really hate is when people in terms of language, when people use places as speakable things. So the White House has said, well, the White House hasn't said anything. It's a big white building. But you can say the President Biden has said. And, back to my world, Downing Street says, well, Downing Street hasn't said anything. The Prime Minister has said it. But you don't want to attribute it to the Prime Minister, maybe because then that sounds too political or something else. So it has to come from the institution that is Downing Street. But kind of going back to that, like one thing that we have done for so long, I think we're getting better at it, but we've done for so long, is this idea of corporate language. And speaking in a corporate way. And what really fascinates me about that is that so much of corporate language nobody uses as human beings. Like it's like they are trying to speak as a building, as an entity. And I don't know quite why that is. Why can't they speak as human beings? Actually, why shouldn't we all be speaking as human beings? After all, that is what we are. Buildings and entities and organizations can't speak. They can't have a voice for themselves. So this kind of language of, let me think of a different way of sort of saying, I apologize for the inconvenience. Let's take that as an example.
Okay.
Nobody speaks like that. I promise you this, that nobody will ever speak to like that. We're chatting now. If I kind of knocked something over and the computer fell down and I lost camera and I lost sound, I wouldn't come back on 2 minutes later and go, I apologize for the inconvenience that this has caused. I'd say, sorry about that. I knocked something over. So why do corporations insist on having this kind of language? Why do we insist on talking about, I hope this email finds you well? Well, the email isn't going to find me anything. You can talk to me like a human being. Let's start there. And I find that really interesting. And again, like going back to the thought leadership, going to talk about how we use language, being better at language, being better at communicating is actually about making connections. And you can only do that when you actually speak on a human to human level. And, I think of it the same, I used to say it, now it's becoming a bit old old hat because people are kind of maybe overusing it too much, and so people just got bored of it. But I used to say, or I used to hear, and I used to kind of repeat that there is no such thing as B2C and B2B. It's about it's about human to human, because whenever we are talking to someone, whether we're talking to a business decision maker or whether we're talking to an individual who's going to buy something in the high street, we are talking to human beings. So this kind of like, and then it got overused and people started hating, oh, stop talking about human to human, human to human. But actually, like, you know, it is, we should still keep saying it, because so often we don't speak like human beings. We speak like organizations, we speak like consumers. We have to sort of say, well, yeah, but what's business? Like, how do we market B2B? How do we market B2B? And how does that compare to B2C? Well, just market like you're speaking like a human being to human beings, and maybe let's start there. Like, you know, rather than overcomplicating things, you know, it must take more work to think about how is a better way of saying I'm sorry. I don't know. Maybe we could just say I'm sorry. You know, it's about having brevity and clarity and shortening things as well. Like, you know, there's lots of kind of intertwined skills that we can bring into that about how we can kind of be more concise and clarity and brevity. But that's what it comes down to. It's about how communication should be about human to human, because there is no other. Well, I guess now we've got AI, so that complicates even more things. But in theory, there is no such thing as non-human to human communication.
On some level, I think it's not a bug, it's a feature. You know, when you look at large multinational corporations, it's much easier to give an employee a number. And, you know, this is employee 10724, and they're not being very productive. You know, they have this jargon that they use in large multinational, but I think that it's much easier to replace employee 175 than it is George, who just lost his kid. You know, on some level, I think that particular language serves a purpose, and it's willful. Like, that language is inserted to talk like a building. You can't get mad at the White House, but you can get mad at Joe Biden. You know, in some ways, it seems like legalese has penetrated the humanity and found a way to exclude themselves from being responsible. You know, in some ways, maybe language is a way to get out of responsibility. That's what that language seems like to me.
I think you're absolutely right. It is that, but the problem with that is that when you get out of responsibility, you also lack empathy. You lack human connections. Like, you know, I think that's the thing. You know, when you think, you could have given the presidential example and taking policies out of it, because otherwise I'll get shouted at when this goes on out. I know we're live as well, but when this goes out, you know, I'll get shouted at for starting to bring presidential politics into it. And I'm British, and I certainly can't have too much of a view on that. But as you absolutely said, like, when you communicate as the White House has said, and White House policies and the executive branch has said this, you distance yourself. Right. But by doing that, you lose empathy and you lose connection. And so people feel more disconnected with their president. And we hear that kind of language, you know, I'm your president, I'm working for you. Yet they still insist on this kind of corporate, the White House has said, the executive branch has released a statement saying da 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 da. Now compare that, again, very face value, because I'm looking at it from outside of the US. But, you know, at very face value, compare that with the communication of Obama, where he's perched on the corner of his Oval Office desk, where he's doing chat shows, where he's doing you know, comedy pieces, when he's doing sketch shows. Like, we instantly feel a connection because actually he's talking more human. Yeah. And I don't know whether there's any research in this, but I would love to look at and actually, even when you look at Trump, like, he did build connections through his communication. You know, you can't deny that. Actually, probably I would say more so than you know, Biden is, because we don't now whether that's because, you know, it appears to me that Biden struggles to be able to even string a sentence together, or whether it's and so hiding behind a building helps. But say what you like about Trump, say what you like about Obama, depending on what camp you're on. You know, I don't care. That's not what this topic is about. Right. Because actually what both of them did was communicate like human beings and form connections. Now, you argue whether that's the right kind of connections. You can argue whether the messages that they say is right because they're speaking to the minority or the masses, but they made connections. Like, you know, and they did that through storytelling, or they did that through communicating their message with greater brevity or clarity or whatever it is. Like, they both did that in their own ways. You know, you could argue more so than President Biden is doing now. As I'm sure that there are lots more presidential communications experts who will say differently, but just on face value, that's how I see it. And I think it's really interesting when you compare those communication styles, because Biden is a lot more, well, I'm the president, I'm the face of the executive branch, but the communications will come from the executive branch. And you know, I think that's super interesting, you know, how we distance that.
Yeah, I do too. What do you see, like, when you're working with people, with whether it's maybe you're working with a group of people or an individual, what is the long-term goal to try to get them to do? Is it to communicate more on an empathetic level? Is it to tell themselves a better story so that they can then tell a better story to the group they're with? Or what is it that when you work with people that you're trying to shine a light on?
I think it's about communicating their authentic self. And I think that it's being, you know, I'm a big fan, or I'm a big believer in people being authentic. I would like to say more authentic, but actually being authentic, actually in the very level of things. So a lot of, you know, I think there's two sides to it. And it very much depends on the individual, because they all struggle with different things. But I think that ultimately what it's about being authentic. It is about doing that through storytelling, because I think that it is easier, or it's strongest, if we can make connections via the stories that we tell and by the experiences that we've lived. But it's also just being about understanding who you are and communicating that. And sometimes it is soul searching. Sometimes it is a little bit about knowing yourself better than maybe you even realize that you know yourself. And so many times, you know, when I sit down with people for the first time, and it, you know, you started off by sort of saying, oh, I think we're just gonna do this in a very conversational way. And it's really interesting that you said that, because that's exactly how I work with clients. Like, people think that I'm going to go, right, what's day one of training? I was like, well, day one, there is no day one, day two, day three of training, really, because that's not the process that I go through. You know, my process is maybe a lot more like a therapist would approach a client, right? You know, I like the power of organic conversation. And actually, because then that goes back to what I believe in, which is about being human to human, and about communication being human to human. So it's, you know, I come from a journalist, and I come from broadcast journalism. So I am used to sitting down with celebrities or politicians or whoever it may be and interviewing them. And my style was always conversational. My style was always about, I just want to get to know you a little bit better. How am I going to do that? Because then if I can get to know them a little bit better, then I can encourage them about how they communicate those messages. And, you know, I have clients that say to me, sort of say, look, I've got so much to say, but I don't know how to say it. I was like, okay, cool. Say it to me in organic conversation then. Let's get that out of you through organic conversation, and you'll find that you do actually know how to say it. The same way that people come to me and say, I'm terrible at telling stories. I was like, I don't think that's true.
Yeah.
Like, I bet you when you were in the pub with your mates the other night, or on Friday night, you told a fantastic story. I bet you did. And so some of the questions that, you know, I might start by sort of telling me a little bit about your career, telling me about where you started, tell me about this, tell me about that. You know, more often than not, I start about just kind of loosening up, just kind of like, tell me about your morning. How was your commute to? We don't commute anymore, do we? We all just work from home. But how was your commute? How was your walk upstairs this morning? How was, you know, what did you have for breakfast? What was the school run like? You know, for me, like, you know, what's the weather doing? Getting them to tell those kind of maybe small stories first is a way of getting them to tell stories that maybe then might lead to kind of more grandeur messaging, because, you know, we all learn something from the experiences that we have. And it's actually really just about retelling those stories. And actually the retelling of those stories is not so much about retelling the stories, it's about reliving them. And how do we, once we relive them, we can retell them. And those are the most powerful stories. When you think when
Yeah.
you are with your friends or your family and they tell a really powerful story, the reason why it is so powerful to you, why you make those connections, is because they're reliving it. Like, they're laughing with you, they're remembering things as they go, because they are literally reliving the event in their minds. And that's when the story is so powerful, when they're not just telling the story, they're reliving it. And that's also how we need to kind of see it. And often that comes out through my method of organic conversation. Let's just sit down, let's just get to know you, let's just chit chat, let's find out more. Like, you and I could be having this conversation in a completely different way. It's where, and I have done interviews and podcasts where it's question 1, question 2, question 3, question 4. Thank you very much. Have you got anything else you'd like to say? And and when you do that, I kind of sometimes, and I'll do that too, but I sometimes come away at the end of that thinking, what have you really learned about me? Like, have you really kind of got a sense about who I am? Have I really got a sense of who you are? Have I really communicated everything that you think that the listeners want to be hearing? And maybe they do or they don't pick up on that, and maybe sometimes you'll never really know. But that organic conversation is when stories and experiences and etc. are communicated, and when you really get a true sense of someone's self, and whether you like them or dislike them. And there's no right or wrong with that, but you get that through organic conversation.
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense, and that's some of the best stories that I've learned from, or that I've been enthralled by, or on the edge of my seat, have to do with fear and vulnerability, and the way in which a person found themselves walking through those, or working through those, or conquered them, or got conquered by them. And when you have to relive that, that's difficult to do. Even though those can be the best stories, and usually are, it's very difficult to get to someone, to have someone relive that, especially if they're not ready to relive that. It is kind of like therapy in a way.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that is when things become, maybe the most powerful. Now, talking about thought leaders a little bit, but also talking about how maybe that happens in a real life example. And one podcast that I'm actually kind of a huge fan of. I was going to say kind of a huge fan of is The Diary of a CEO. And I mentioned it earlier as we were chatting. The reason is because whatever you think of Stephen Bartlett, I may have my views. I've never met the man, but I may have my views about him in the context of this thought leadership thing that I've already talked about. I maybe have a few issues about that, but credit where credit's due. He is, I don't know what it is, but he is very good at getting people to open up. He is very good at getting people to tell stories where you really feel connected. You really see maybe a different side to somebody. And those are the true stories. Now, I feel like, those have been the most powerful stories that I've listened to on that podcast. The ones that I feel like are least powerful are the, thought leader scientists or the thought leader doctors that come on, spout whatever they want to spout, and it sounds breakthrough and it's amazing and it's an interesting, supposedly it's an innovative thought because they're saying something different about ADHD or something different about diet or something different about what we should be eating or drinking, and we should be quitting coffee and blah, 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 blah. I hate those less. Sorry, I hate those more. I don't. Those are the ones I don't listen to. But when you get the real, honest, open up type stories, when you, as you say, when you hear those struggles, when you hear those lived experiences, and some of the most powerful ones I heard of that series was Stephen Fry, Richard Hammond, people who have been. Now, I'm not saying that all of the other people that he's had on have also gone through stuff. But those are just two examples, and there are others where people have communicated really hard-hitting stuff, and you've really felt that emotional connection with them by them opening up, by them telling stories, and being honest, and yeah, showing that vulnerability. There's a big part of that. But people are scared to do that. Like, again, it goes back to the White House has said, Downing Street has said, maybe there is a nervousness about opening up. There's a nervousness about showing. Sometimes there's nervousness about showing emotion. Like, particularly with leaders, we feel like leaders shouldn't show emotion. Leaders shouldn't be showing any kind of vulnerability when they're in that powerful position, particularly world leaders. It's very, they sort of, they shouldn't be doing this, they shouldn't be doing this. We see the reputational crises pop up when they do something that they think is unpresidential or not like a prime minister should be behaving like. We saw that, for example, with the Finnish prime minister. A video was released about her partying. God forbid a young person has been seen partying. She's no longer allowed to do that because she's a prime minister. I find that, even though it was, I don't know, like, I find that really interesting. Like, the persona, the environment that we put on people, like, where we impose how someone should behave based on the position that they have. Whereas actually, maybe we would just open up a little bit more if we saw them more as human beings and they communicated as such. And that includes vulnerability. And that's, sometimes when those connections are made most powerfully is when we do have that vulnerability and make a connection through that.
Yeah, it's well said. Sometimes the story is through like hearing. An example is when trauma strikes you. I'll give you an example. When I was a few years ago, like 7 years ago, my wife and I, we were getting ready to have our first child. And like everybody that knows, like your first child, like you pack the bags, you're getting ready, you do the Lamaze class, you know what I mean? And you're like, okay, what do? I got to count to 10, 1, 2, 3, 4. And it's all these things are going on and you're preparing for what's happening. And I'll never forget, we're waiting for her water to break. And it was like month 9 and we have the car stuff packed. And my wife's like, hey, George, we got to go to the hospital. And I'm like, okay. I'm like, are you sure? Because I didn't see your water break. She's like, we got to go to the hospital. I'm like, okay. But there's like this weird aura of like wrongness. Sometimes when something's wrong, it's palpable and you can feel it, and it's just like there's a problem. And we rush to the hospital and we go into the emergency room and, we walk up to the counter and my wife's 9 months pregnant and we go, we need to get into the hospital. We think there's an issue right here. And the nurse looks at us. She goes, okay, fill out this paperwork and we'll get you right up. And so we sit down and we fill out the paperwork and, there was a bunch of people in the waiting room. And one guy gets up and he's like, I was here before them. And, my arm is really killing me. And I don't know why you gave them paperwork first. I'll never forget that part of it for some reason. I'm like, and the lady's like, she's pregnant. She didn't call him a dummy, but she's like, that lady is 9 months pregnant, sir. Please sit down. I was like, yeah, thinking to myself, like, good for her, and so they rush us up to the room and we have our own room and our doctor's not there because she's on call, but there's obviously doctors in the delivery room and they come in and they shut the curtain. And at this point in time, like I can look at my wife and I know there's a problem, but it's dead silence in the room. And the guy comes up and he hooks up the ultrasound. And like, for me, this moment was one of those moments. I'm sure people listening to this and yourself have had these moments where time stands still. It's just, there's no heartbeat. There's nothing. It's just like the ultrasound's up. And I look at my wife. I look at the doctor. I look at the ultrasound. Look at my wife. I look at the doctor. I look at the ultrasound. And it feels like an hour's gone by, but it's just me shifting my focus between these three different, my wife, whom I love, and this doctor I don't know, and this machine. And the doctor turns to me and he's like, I'm sorry. Your child has passed away. And like, it's one of these moments you're like, what the fuck are you talking about? What are you talking about? This, what? And it's through tragedies like that. Like it's those tragedies. It's these ideas of the horrible things that shouldn't happen to anybody. And it takes a while to integrate these things. But when something like that happens to you, it's imperative that when you figure out how to integrate it, that you tell that story. In some way, I think you're given a gift. You, as someone who went through a tragedy, you are now given the sight to see other people, help them through it, to hold their hand through it, to see it before it may happen, to see it after it happened, to see while it happened. And it's those stories that happen to all of us. And every one of us has a story. Some of us may not be brave enough to tell it yet. Some of us may not have had the story happen to us yet. But I rest assured, anyone listening to this, your story is coming. And it's both magic and tragic, but I hope that when your story happens, you're able to capture the magic in it and tell it to people, because that is what we're here to do as humans. We're here to tell our story so that other people can find where they are on the path. It's those stories that everybody has, and maybe that's what everybody gets to be, a thought leader for a moment in time. Maybe everyone gets to have their 15 minutes of fame. I don't think that's a great way to put it, but everyone gets to be center stage in front of the fire to tell their story to the rest of us. And I think that that is a way we need to communicate. In some ways, I wish we could go back to almost a communal level where everyone could, maybe we could all, every Friday, everybody goes down to wherever it is, their campfire or their VFW or whatever, but they have that opportunity to do it, and sometimes it's at the workplace, sometimes it's at a family gathering. But I think that the idea of storytelling should be taught in schools, or I think more people should be listening to what you're doing, because I think in some ways you're helping people tell their stories. But that was just an example. I think it's important, right? Everybody's got a story.
Yeah, and thanks for sharing that, because I think you're right. I think that everybody has a story, and you say not everybody, thank God, have lived through tragic events like that they are able to tell, let alone be kind of willing to. I think that that opening up side of things, whether it's a tragic side, whether it's a funny story, whether it's something that's gone wrong, whether it's something that's tragic, I think that there is something a little bit about, I don't want to open up about that. That's personal to me.
Yes.
That's my life. Like, why should I open up about that? I think that there is, I don't know, I'm not in any place to sort of say, everybody should be saying about everybody about their lives, but I am typically a very open person, and very, very open and very kind of transparent, generally quite transparent about my life now. But to be honest with you, I haven't always. There's also, in this world of social media as well, we live up to some kind of aspiration, or we believe that we should be creating, that's another thing, is the fact that, maybe people don't like that because actually they want to be perceived as their life being perfect. And that's why they don't tell those kind of stories. The same way that we put filters on Instagram, or we stage the perfect family breakfast when actually there's complete chaos going on behind us. And I think that there's really an interesting of kind of vulnerability just actually in opening up and being honest and being able to sort of be transparent. Now, you're right, not everybody is maybe able to do that, but and there are certainly some stories that people don't necessarily need to go to. I'm not sort of saying, right, everybody needs to have a tragic story. Right. Everybody needs to have something that's going to make people, make the listener cry or break, to do that or the other. But so maybe your storytelling is something else. Maybe it is amusing, but or maybe it's showing vulnerability in a different kind of way. Maybe it's sort of saying, this was a time where I fucked up. Yes, and this is how I fucked up.
Yeah,
and I think I have not had a chance to be to one yet, but I know that in both in America and here in Europe, there are things called fuck up nights. Have you heard of these?
No, I haven't heard of them.
So these are corporate nights, and I'm no way am I being paid for, by the way. I'm not being endorsed by fuck up nights X City, but I think that they're a fantastic concept. And the idea is that they are corporate networking events, but people get to go on stage, and instead of doing an inspirational keynote, how I made £2 million in 2 minutes type stuff that actually you see on LinkedIn all of the time,
right?
Instead, they're kind of like, let me tell you about a time that I completely fucked up.
Yeah.
And people are kind of share and they revel in those stories. And I think that's a fantastic concept, because it really is opening up that idea of vulnerability. It doesn't need to be something as tragic as the story that you told us, or an individual's tragic story that they're retelling, but it is a way of people being more vulnerable in their failures and opening up to that. And I think that can be hugely powerful. And I think that's also there's a lot of finding yourself in being able to do that, in being able to open up and sort of say, yeah, there were times when I really hurt people. There were times when I
Yep.
made mistakes. There were times when I did things that was, showed a lack of empathy towards another individual. There were times where I really shouldn't have treated someone like that. And I, maybe I'll never build that relationship back, but I'm sure as hell gonna try. But so maybe it's those kind of vulnerable stories that are as important. Even if you don't, and God bless you, don't have those like really tragic moments that you're going to tell. But at the same time, I also think that there's then the next part, I guess, is why are you telling that story? Like, what's your message behind it? I got asked the other day on a different podcast. I got asked about, like, name a communicator that you just think has got it down, nailed it, like has just got it down to a T, that you completely admire. And I went fucking way back, and I went to Aesop.
That is way back.
And it is way back. It is way back. I never knew the guy, but he was a great communicator, because everything that I believe about communication, it being succinct, is following a story pattern. You feeling for the characters, and then at the end of the day, they're having a clear message behind that story. But actually, if you wanted to go and study storytelling and about how stories are constructed that then tell a message, go and listen to the backlog of Aesop's fables, because they do all of those things in such a way that is so unique, that I feel like actually no one has done since, really. That to me, he's probably one of the world's greatest communicators because of that, because of the way that he tells stories and then tells us a message. Now, back at the time, it was foxes and hares and tortoises and whatever else that he was using to illustrate his points. But actually, if you take those formulas, if you take those formats and apply those to our own personal stories, apply that to our own lived experiences, then you can come away with something truly powerful. And then you can kind of come away with right, this is the story, and what I learned from that is, and how I now do things differently is because, or I will never do this, or I'll never do that, I'll never disbelieve someone, or whatever, like, whatever it may be. So I think I've lost my train of thought as to kind of quite why I was kind of making that reference, but it is about understanding what you're trying to say with that story. Like, I think the risk is that when we sort of say people should be opening up more, people should be more personal, is that people tell a tragic story and then, like, I don't really know what to do with that information. Like, I don't really know how to come away with that. So it's also then about communicating of, like, I lived through this, but I came out okay in at the other end, and you will too. Whatever you are going through, the sun will still rise tomorrow. That kind of really, that kind of message, that take-home message, that it's going to be okay, that life is going to be okay, and I think that that's a really powerful message, actually, for sometimes all to hear, whatever that may be.
Is that your philosophy? Like, do you look at your life as a story? Like, when you begin telling things, like, is that your framework for your life? Like, this is the Alex story. Do you when you begin telling about your life, do you look at your life as, like, I'm the main character in this incredible novel, and I'm not sure what chapter I'm on, or I'm on this chapter? Do you look at your life as a story?
I do sometimes. I have to admit, like, I hear and I read a lot about, people talk about, like, well, what are the stories you should have? You should have the hero story, or you should follow this framework, or you should follow this, that, and the other. And then, of course, one of them is that they sort of say, you should also have your founder story. You should also have your origin story. And I've thought about that a few times. I do. In a way, I have plenty of origin stories or founder stories, and I do sometimes think about that when people sort of say, like, tell me your founder story, tell me your origin story. It's like, how far back do you want to go? Like, like, I don't remember, like, the day that I was born. Like, I can't really I'm not sure if I can really recall that. So it's really interesting that you talk about that kind of like, well, what is a founder story versus an origin story or anything else? But I think that's actually it is really powerful when you start thinking about your life as a story.
Yeah.
And how you would put that down and how you would think about that. Like, I think that, maybe we should all be thinking about at some point in our lives when the time is right or whatever, but like at some point in life, we should all be thinking about penning our memoirs so that we actually get a chance to be able to tell our life story. And sometimes it is those stories, those micro stories come out when we actually think way back. Well, what happened then? Like, what happened now? And I've been going back a little bit as well more recently. I've been looking into my family history, finding that fascinating on the different sides of the family. And as a result, it's going through kind of old documents, it's going through old photos of me. And then I start thinking about like, wow, how did that shape where I am now? Like, how did I get from that to this? And the stuff that I've completely forgotten about. One example of this is that the other day I was back in my family home, and I was kind of collecting together, or like, oh, this was kept, and this was kept, and this was kept. And I remembered, and this is something that for some reason I remember, and I remembered that I won a poetry competition when I believe I was like 9 or 10 years old. And then I start kind of thinking about, well, how did that impact where I am now? And here I am kind of thinking about how I tell stories, how I can write better, how I can communicate better. And yet, even at 9 or 10, subconsciously, I was thinking a little bit about how can I tell a story differently and how can I get my story out differently. And what I will say is that the subject, that the title of that poem was called The Bully, and it was all about, and it was about bullying. And I was bullied as a child. Like, I had a kind of a pretty horrific childhood, being bullied at school. And my avenue then was not to, I could have done, I guess TEDx probably wasn't invented then, but I could have stood on a stage and saying, let me tell you about the last year where I've been bullied. But that wouldn't have been right. People wouldn't have gone, yeah, well, of course you've been bullied. Everyone's, plenty of people have been bullied who are 9 and 10 years old in secondary school. Like that's not unusual. But my avenue then was through poetry. And then since then, I've kind of gone back and looked at other poems I've written and kind of like, what was I thinking? Like, who did I write that for? Or what was going through my mind when I'm thinking about those things? So I think that's really interesting when we start looking back at our little anecdotes in our lives and how that has shaped who we are today. And I do now think back to that and go like, maybe in one way or another, like even back at 9 or 10, something subconsciously, the power of the universe was saying, you are going to be a communicator. You are going to work in communications. And at the moment, this is through poetry. Later on in life, I did a lot of performing arts. So then that was my avenue of communication. And now it's about corporate communication and public speaking and everything else. So it's followed a natural train of there's been lots of kind of craziness in between all of that, but ultimately this has been the red thread, if you will, that's followed it ever since I was 9 years old. I've always been about communication, and I've always been about finding an avenue for that communication. I've always wanted to communicate to the world, whether that's through poetry or whether that's coming on the True Life podcast. I've always been about communicating to people and communicating to as many people as possible, and now it's about helping people communicate better. And I think that's something, the more you think about it, the more I realize how powerful that is.
Yeah, I love that. It seems to me that when we get to a point in our life where we go back and we start looking at our story, that's when we know we've taken control of the story. Now, all of a sudden, we can see that red thread or that Ariadne thread that has ran all the way through. But at the time, we were like, well, I guess I just did a poem, But now you look back and you're like, of course that happened. How couldn't that have happened? And as soon as you can get that perspective, and this is why I love the idea of telling your life as a story, is that it gives you the freedom to confront the things that happen to you from a third person perspective, from like the narrator's perspective or the author's perspective, and you're like, oh yeah, of course I did that. Well, if I did that, and now you can move the story forward and be like, well, if I did that, then of course I see the pattern in my story now, and like, of course that was a threshold guardian. You know what? I'm on the third threshold guardian now, and I'm getting ready for the big fight coming. I start training, I start working out a little more,
And then there's maybe also when you start thinking again about those vulnerabilities, about those weak spots, because then you start thinking about, because you might communicate it in one way, and generally kind of like, there's something psychologically about how we look at the positives in life, right? We look at all of the great things that happen, and we sometimes forget the bad things, and that's psychological. Like, you can't often do anything about that. Like, we forget the negatives. And I think sometimes when you do look back, because you then look back at your life and go, oh, I did poetry, and then I did performing arts, and then I moved to China and did some broadcasting, and then I came back and did corporate communications, including at Downing Street, and now I moved to Denmark, and now I'm teaching other people how to communicate better. You're going to go, cool. Well, you pretty much had your life like sewn up in one neat little journey, didn't you? I was going, well, no, because like between all of that, like, it was like there were times that were really fucking difficult. There were times where I was struggling to make a living, or there was times when I was doing X, Y, and Z. There were times when I got myself into huge amounts of debt and had to try and crawl myself out of it and beg for forgiveness from the people that I hurt through that. So on paper, started writing poems. Now he's teaching communication. Cool, happy days. But it's only when you start to question, like, but my God, has it been difficult getting here? And it's probably going to be still difficult in the years to come.
Yeah.
Do you realize how, okay, I now need to put those elements into my story too. I now need to sort of say, I need to open up more. And it's when you open up more, do you kind of realize, like, okay, now that makes sense. Now I trust that person a little bit more. Now I believe him a little bit more, because he's being open and honest about these struggles that person has had, about the challenges that he's overcome to get to where he is today. And again, it is about empathy. It's about building connections. And I do think that we need those vulnerable moments to be communicated, however small or major they may be, in order for people to kind of feel some kind of empathy towards us. Now, the risk is that people will hate that story. Like, how could that possibly be? Like, how could he have got himself into so much trouble? How could he have done that? I don't trust him now because he did X, Y, and Z. Why would I listen to what he says about this when he did this? That's a risk, and maybe people are scared of that risk. But I don't have to be for everybody, And going back to thought leadership, you can lead one person in thought, and that's okay. And it's also okay, therefore, that you don't have to be liked by everybody. You're not going to be liked for everybody. Not everybody's going to like you. And the real trick is being okay with that. And everybody will say, well, no, of course not everybody's going to like it. But are you really okay with that? And are you okay with maybe only 2 or 3 people like you? Maybe only 2 or 3 people get what you're doing. But if you can truly, truly deliver something of value and make meaningful connections with those half a dozen people, then maybe that's good enough. And so there's a big part of that. Overcoming fears of not everybody liking you, overcoming fears of showing your vulnerable side and people finding you, and sometimes you'll tell your real story and people will say, that I'm sure that never really happened. I'm sure that's just a story to tell. Like, they won't believe you, and that's okay too. Like, you have to say, well, that's on you. I don't have to have you believing me. I'm just opening up. I'm just telling you my story, and hoping that finds meaning for somebody somewhere out there.
Yeah, I love it. Sometimes I wonder, stories have been with us since the beginning, whether you read the Iliad and the Odyssey. And sometimes I wonder, I'm curious to get your opinion. I had a friend tell me the other day that he thinks we're outgrowing the hero's journey. And that got me thinking about, like, wow, is it possible that we could be in a period of time where a new mythology is taking place. And might a new mythology change our ability to see the story in someone else? Like if you look at this giant demographics that we have, like there's this giant demographic of baby boomers throughout the world. And it seems that a lot of them are knocking on the door to the mortality experience. And there's this new generations coming up. And sometimes maybe there's a lot of things lost in translation. Can you think of a time in the past, and is this even possible, where the stories, the foundation and the path of the story is becoming unrecognizable to another generation?
Ooh, I think I do, in a way, I do wish that we are getting tired of the hero's journey or the hero's story.
Okay.
Because it goes against what we've just talked about that vulnerability. Like, it suggests that there is a hero to be had in all of us.
Yes,
or it suggests that the hero's journey kind of has it all like pretty much wrapped up. Like, I'm gonna say, like, when we talk about hero, right, I'm gonna take superhero, use the superhero analogy. Like, I find it people sort of say, oh, like, you really feel for the characters, and like, take Spider-Man, for example. At no point do I feel particularly sad for Spider-Man. I think he's kind of got it. I think he's got life all right down. Like, like he gets to save the world. He ultimately gets the girl. Like, and people go, yeah, but he struggled, and he was bullied, and he overcame. No, he only overcame that because he got bit by a spider and got superpowers. Like, he didn't really go through any struggles to get there. And that's what I, you talk about the hero's journey, that when you it's difficult to say hero and not think superhero.
Yeah.
So you can go back down that kind of avenue, I guess, in a little bit. And I think the problem is with the hero's journey is that it focuses on that word hero. And I know people sort of say, oh, like, another word for the hero's journey is the founder's journey, or the founder's story. And so maybe that's different, but it still doesn't focus enough on the trials and tribulations. It doesn't focus enough on the fact that there must be ups and downs. It doesn't focus enough on the true, I guess, stories that are needed to get there, like the ebb and flow, if you will, of the story to get there. It doesn't focus enough on failures. It doesn't focus enough about the challenges that they overcame. And I think that's the problem that I have on it. Not so much the actual framework or the formula, but more that the way that it's titled, that it suggests about how did that person become a hero. And actually, maybe it's okay to focus on something else. Maybe it's about the failures story. Like, not everything has a happy ending. Yeah. And life doesn't necessarily have a happy ending. In fact, it doesn't. Actually, we all end up dying. So there's something to said about, like, maybe it's okay to say, this story does not have a happy ending, but I'm still going to tell it because it is something that's powerful, and we can all learn something from it, and we can all feel something about it. And that's okay. So, like, maybe we need to not necessarily replace, but we also need to think a lot about, like, the failures journey, or something that didn't necessarily have a happy ending. The hero's journey suggests that there's a happy ending at the end, and I get it. Like, maybe we all like happy endings. Like, maybe that's the thing. Like, psychologically, we really want something to have a happy ending. But I also think that the story is even more powerful sometimes when it doesn't, because life doesn't.
Yeah, as we're talking, it makes me think that maybe it's something in our genetic code for life to move on. And that's why we celebrate that framework of, like, life must continue on in some way, and we have kids, and maybe it's retooling our relationship with adversity that can change the story to a more meaningful one, where And then I started thinking like, wow, George, what do you just want to tell sad stories to everybody? No one's want to listen to my stories if I tell only sad stories, but there's got to be more meaning in there than
I think
just
that's the thing,
hero.
and it
Yeah.
does come down to meaning. It's like,
Yeah.
like, well, you can tell a sad story as long as you take something away from it, as long
Yeah.
as that there is,
Yeah.
and sometimes that meaning might be, you know what, I got to know that person a little bit better because of his vulnerability, because I heard about that particular time of vulnerability, or maybe it's the meaning is because everybody thinks that I've got this all locked up and got my life made, and actually it's life has still been a struggle like it has been for so many people, and that's okay to tell the story. So I think there's still got to be a meaning. That's kind of like what I said, really. There's still got to be some kind of meaning out of it, rather than just well, that's a really sad story, but what's the takeaway? Like what's the part of it? And sometimes it might be like, but things are going to be okay in the end, and this is why I'm telling the story, is that the universe didn't have it all kind of figured out for you then, but it did, or it will, or so whether it's a hope thing or whether it's a some kind of message in that towards the end. And you're right, like it isn't just about it isn't just about always telling sad stories. You do
Right.
want that ebb and flow, right? You want to go from like, I'm going to tell you a really sad story now to I'm now going to make you laugh, or I'm going to break the break the tension, so to speak. I'm going to make you go through this emotional journey. And actually that is what great stories do. You look at any movie, the last great movie that you saw, and you think about the story as that went through that ebb and flow. Most likely it went through a kind of like, you feel sorry for a character, and then their life gets better and you feel better for them, and then maybe something goes horribly wrong again, but all in the end most movies end up with a happy ending, but and so that it ends there. So you kind of go through that kind of like, I like this person, I dislike this person, I feel sorry for this person, now I feel like he had it coming to him, and then like that's the journey that we all go emotionally. We enjoy those emotional stories. Like we need that roller coaster. We need that emotional journey ourselves because we realize maybe subconsciously we realize that that's what life is all about. There's always going to be ups and downs, and so when we hear stories that have those ups and downs, those ebbs and flows, we relate to them more, and so therefore we enjoy them more. We get more from them, however they end up, whether they end up with a happy ending or not. We still take something from it.
Yeah, I love it. I have this idea I'm working on. I want to get your opinion about it. So I think some of the people, well, let me start off like this. I've been speaking with some people who are death doulas, and they'll sit with the people in palliative care as their last few days. And some of the talks that I've had with the death doulas are mesmerizing in ways. And anybody who's ever read a biography about someone they admired, or an autobiography about someone that they admired, and they talk about their last days, it's never, I wish I would have spent more time in the office. I wish I would have made more money. It's always, I wish I would have been a better husband. I wish I would have been a better person. I wish I would have taken more vacations. I wish I would have told my wife I loved her more. I wish I would have hugged my kid more. It's all of these things, and it seems to me that people who have gotten to a certain part of their life can look back with a clarity that most people can't get until you get there. And so one thing I'm working on my podcast is that I've been reaching out to some people who are in palliative care, and I want them to come on and tell their story, because they have the best stories. They have a clarity with which they can speak to that none of us can thoroughly understand. And I'm curious to get your opinion. Like, how do you think that would be received? In my mind, I have this idea, like it could be a sort of virtual campfire where everyone listening could get the opportunity to hear someone tell their story, maybe for the final time. I think there's a lot of gravity there, right? Like, what do you think about that as an idea and as a way to build a bridge between generations?
It is very interesting. I think that you're right. I think that there is something that's very interesting, and I think that people would find very interesting about the learnings or the clarity that somebody has when they're in that stage of their life, because I don't think that we ever really know And we also
Yeah.
don't really think about like, well, what will we think when we get there? Like
Yeah.
what will we think when we hit that moment in time, whenever that is, hopefully later rather than sooner. But whenever we hit that time, that's our time. Like, what will we think? How will we look back at our life? How will we look back at how we have treated it? And as you say, no one will say, I should have worked harder, or I should have spent more time in the office, or I should have done any of those things. Maybe sometimes those things are interlinked.
Sure.
People might sort of say, I wish I'd have been able to provide for my kids more. I wish I had been able to give them more experiences. But in a way that you'd feel like that would be the wrong way of looking at it, because that's not what they're thinking. They're not thinking, I wish Dad had spent more money on me.
Yeah.
They're just thinking, I wish I would have had more time with him, like, or whatever it may be. So I think that there's something very powerful about that. And the same way that sometimes the most powerful stories that I've heard have been people who have been close to that and maybe
Yeah.
come through it on the other end, like, where what did they have in their minds? Like, what were they thinking when they went through that? And I think that more often than not, I think that, and I could be wrong, and maybe when you'll get those stories, I'll be proved otherwise, and I'm more than happy to be so. But I think most of those people won't regret much about what they've done. They might say, you kind of like, they're basic kind of like, I wish I'd done things, would I be living it again? I'll do things a little bit differently. But that's not quite the same as regret.
Yeah.
And I think that when I look back at my life now, when I look back at my life story, there are certainly things that I would probably do differently. But then every time where I think about, like, well, I would do that differently, they're not about the choices that I made. Would I have stayed working in TV production in the UK, or rather than pursuing some kind of journalistic radio career in Beijing? Well, no, because I went to Beijing and I met my wife, and I'm now back in living in Denmark with 2 wonderful children because I made the random decision to go to China. And so, no, I don't regret that decision. Throughout my life, I regret the ways that I treated people, the ways that, how I know that I have hurt people along the course of my life. Do I regret that? And if I was in the end today or tomorrow, do I wish that I hadn't hurt them? Of course I do. Of course I would do that differently. But at the same time, in terms of the actions and the decisions that I make in terms of my life story, as we did it, like, what did he go on to do and the stages of his life, I don't regret any of those things. So I think that more often that will be the biggest thing that people will say on their last day is what do you regret? And it will be how you treated other people. And if we can all think about that, if we can all think about that almost on a day-to-day basis, not in the morbid or kind of like, well, what if I die tomorrow? Like, no one's suggesting that you do that. You should also live life. But if you just think a little bit about, well, what would you regret if this was your last day on Earth? If not even yours, like, if this was, the Earth was going to explode tomorrow, what would be your biggest regret? And I bet most people would say it's how I treated other people. Because I think that we can all treat people better sometimes, and sometimes that'll be on a major way. Sometimes that will be like, I really hurt people. I really, it's unfathomable the hurt and sadness that I brought around people. But for other people, it will be like, I should have treated that one person better. I dismissed that person. Maybe it's a leader who sort of said, like, I should have treated that person that I fired in 2007. I should have treated them a little bit better. I should have had a bit more empathy for them. And and I think that's probably the most likely, is that people will regret how they treat other people. And I think that if we can all think about that sometimes, that will also improve our life now. So rather than it just being on your deathbed, what would you do differently when you can't do anything about it? If we start thinking about those things now, then maybe we can turn our lives around, or maybe we can treat people a little bit better. And if we can treat people a little bit better, and communication, of course, has a big part to play in that as well.
Yeah.
But if we can communicate better, maybe, and we can start, and as a result, we can start treating people a little bit better, then maybe the world can be a bit of a better place. And maybe that's very grandioso and very idealistic, and never is going to happen. But even on a small part to play, going back to thought leaders, you don't have to be a thought leader to millions and millions of people. You can influence the lives or the skills or something of one person, and you've led them because you made them think differently. And the same goes for maybe how we live our lives. If we can have more empathy, if we can help more people, if we can think about how we treat other people more, and if we can just treat one person better than we would have done had we not thought about it, then we've succeeded. And if we all think about that, then that, in theory, is something hugely powerful. And as I said, like, communication has a big part to play with that. And that's why I started today in our conversation saying just that when we improve our communication skills, we can improve so many areas of our lives. And that's and other people's lives. I mean, that's also the powerful thing, that, you communicate a message clearly, you communicate with empathy, you treat someone differently through more empathetic communication, then you also improve their lives too. You improve how they think about you. You improve, maybe it has that ripple effect. I'm a big fan of that ripple effect of, like, if you can help one person, then they'll help somebody else who helps somebody else, and suddenly the world's perfect or something.
Yeah, I think it speaks to what you brought up earlier too about authenticity, where when you start telling yourself when you begin to tell yourself a story that is more accurate, then you can begin to have relationships that are better, that are more full. When you begin to be honest with yourself, you begin having a more honest relationship, and that is that ripple effect out there. And maybe that is the way, maybe it's what Gandhi said about, if you want to change the world, then be the change that you want to see, because that is how you could affect a conversation like this, could affect 100 people, 1,000 people, or maybe 10 people. But the fact that it radiates outward and can touch a handful of people, and then they can all touch a handful of people, maybe that's how the world changes, and it does seem through communication, through stories, and especially on the topic of death, because it seems so taboo in the West. Like, everyone's so afraid of this idea. Like the word palliative, the root pa'a means to shroud death, and palliative care means to shroud this thing. And why do we shroud something? Because we're afraid of it, or we want to talk about it because it's messy. We don't want to look at it. It speaks volumes of our relationship to it. So to uncover it and look at it, and then that can have the ability. It's interesting to think that someone who is facing death could give the gift of life to somebody else. Like, oh my gosh, I should change my life now. Like, it's such a powerful thing to think about. What maybe you could talk a little bit about that, about our relationship with death and how we communicate.
Yeah, I think that we, there's nothing to say that we couldn't or shouldn't. I think that it's trying to find the balance, right? It's trying to find again, it goes back to, like, the reason why you're communicating it. Like, I don't think it should or needs to be in the kind of the morbid of, like, let's all think more about death, because in a way I feel like that's potentially a slippery path. It's also potentially, I also think that it is you've also got to realize that there are people who will take that very literally, and that there are people who will think back on their lives and think that they haven't done any good, and that they haven't done negatively, and then maybe they're not in the right frame of mind, and then they do something that they all regret, and that's also another really interesting thing, is that when people who have been spoken to, and they've done interviews with people who have tried to commit suicide and have failed, and they all regret it. Like, nearly 100% of them regret trying to end their life when they actually sit down and go, like, why did you try? And or do you regret it, or do you wish that you had succeeded? They all regret it. So anyway, but my point being is the fact that, like, the problem with or we need to be careful getting to the point where we are in a situation of saying, let's all think about, if we were to die tomorrow, what would we change? Because that could be a slippery slope for people who are maybe not in a frame of mind, in the right mental state to be able to take on that challenge of thought. And so it is a dangerous path that you need to tread a little bit, with always going, let's think more about death, because it will make us more reflective. But I certainly think that we can think about our lives and thinking, and with the understanding that it's never too late to change. Like, it's never too late to change the way that you approach someone. It's never too late to say I'm sorry. It's never too late to show remorse or regret about maybe the way that you've treated people, or that you'd wish you'd always said something to somebody, or whatever it may be. It's never too late to communicate. So even, as you say, in those situations where you're in palliative care and you know that the end is genuinely nigh, even then it's not too late to sort of say, I wish I'd apologized to someone. I wish I'd treated someone better. If at all possible, like now's the time, right? There's no other time to do it.
Now's the time.
So it is I think that then becomes more powerful. So rather than the sort of the death, the morbid death element of it, just more about, there has never been a better time like now to make a change, to change your behavior, to change the way that you do something, in the hope that then that has that ripple effect. Like, let's go talk about that. Ultimately, it's all about that ripple effect. I think that sometimes thought leadership can be like that as well. Like, the idea, true thought leadership is when, you inspire one person, which then inspires another, which inspires another, which inspires another, and then you get that ripple effect, which I think is hugely powerful, and people maybe don't talk about enough. That ripple effect. People don't talk about that enough. They just talk about having 1 million followers and what that means. They don't necessarily talk about how actually it can be incremental, or maybe they don't necessarily become followers of the original person who had the original thought, but they are still having thoughts of their own. They're telling their story more authentically. They're talking about their life more. They're communicating better. Win-win. Maybe it's not directly with the architect, but the ripple effect is definitely there. And that's, I think that when someone was asking me a little bit, how do you measure thought leadership? Is it just about followers, or is it just about number of engagements or comments on a post that seem to be interesting? But I don't think it is that. I think you have to look at the ripple effect. And that's really, I think, going back to where we started talking, was about what a thought leader is. It goes back to, it's not just about speaking to 1 million people or speaking to a few. It's about communicating something that has that ripple effect, that can ripple through to more and more people. And that's when it's the most powerful.
Yeah, it seems to me that a good communicator is able to be contagious with their thoughts. They can convey it. It's like the same way, like it seems that there's two things that there's two parts that are contagious, and it's inspiration and desperation. And we see that from people that are speakers. Sometimes the speech that changes the world comes from desperation. Sometimes it comes from inspiration. But what are those two horses pulling that cart in the world of communication? What do you think about those two horses?
Yeah. Continues to go deep, I guess. But I mean, I think that they have a part to play. I don't know. I think that ultimately it is about, again, it goes back to the same thing. It's about being authentic, right? And I feel like you've frozen. Have you frozen? I'm not sure if you can still hear me or not. I feel like the broadcast is completely frozen. Your picture has certainly frozen. I'm hoping that it's not me. The live counter is still counting, so I'm hoping it's not me. It's just your video that stopped. But in case people are still tuning into the live, I'll carry on talking. Even though your connection seems to have lost. But I think kind of like what the interesting thing about communication is that it is all about authenticity, right? And it is all about maintaining authenticity that also you're happy with. And when we talk a little bit about that ripple effect, and I think that's super powerful. And I remember last year, I don't know if anybody saw it, the Ryan Reynolds Christmas musical called Spirited, which, as we approach Christmas now, I think maybe this is a good time to mention it again. And they talk about this ripple effect, right? They talk about how the fact that actually, if they can make someone better, if they can improve someone's personality, if they can make them a better human being, very much Christmas Carol-esque, then it's not about changing that one person. It's about the ripple effect that then causes. It's about, if you change one person's lives, they'll become better to somebody else, which will become someone better to somebody else, to become somebody better. So I recommend, as we lead towards Christmas, I recommend everybody to go and watch the Christmas movie, Spirited, with who is it, Ryan Reynolds and Will Ferrell and Ryan Reynolds, and they're Spirited, because I think that is it's a great movie anyway, but it is true about that ripple effect. And the thing with the Christmas Carol, if you go back to the kind of the original version of that, is that the Christmas Carol was really, that's what it was about. Like, I mean, actually that original was about just changing Scrooge as a person, and they did that by looking back at his life and making him realize that there are changes that can be made in terms of ultimately about the way that he treated people. And when he changed his view on that, people will look at that and then go, right, actually now I can change. And again, if we go back to kind of thinking about what a powerful story is, actually the Christmas Carol is a hugely powerful story, but only if you see it in regards to having that ripple effect, having the idea of the fact that something you can affect one person's life, and then ultimately that will move on, and then we'll go on to somebody else. So I think that's hugely powerful. And I'm not sure if George Monty is coming back. I'm gonna hold on for just a little bit longer, to see if they're going to be coming back to this live broadcast, or not. But I'm certainly I'm still here. There isn't even is there a chat that if people are tuned in live, then maybe you can ping some questions into the chat. And I actually can't see the chat, but anyway, if anybody is tuning in live and they want to ask some questions, it will certainly help me out, because I'm not sure if George is going to be coming back to us. So if anybody is tuned in live or not, I have just had a message that George Monty's power has gone out in his house, which is why his video feed cut. So I'm not sure whether he'll be back momentarily. So I will stay on there. As I said, if anybody is still tuned in live, I know that some people are may or may not be tuning in live. So if anybody's tuning in live and wants to fire some questions in the chat, the chat is is live, and I can see it. So if anybody wants to kind of literally throw some questions out, then I'm more than happy to help answer them. Well, we hope that maybe George comes back into the live stream. But I'll give it 5 minutes otherwise, and if not, then I will just have to disconnect, and maybe there'll be a part 2 in some point in the future. Otherwise, but otherwise, I will hold fire for a few minutes. All right. Well, I have just had a message from George, who is struggling to get his connection back at the moment. I believe that his power has gone in his house. So we're going to cut the live stream now here, or at least I will leave the studio, which I assume will cut the live stream. But thanks. I'd like to extend my thanks, George, for having me. It's been a fantastic conversation, and I will, for those of you who may want to kind of hear the rest or the end of our conversation, then we'll see if we can organize a part 2 or even recommence the live broadcast when power has been resumed. But I also know that it's extremely late there in Hawaii, so maybe we'll do a part 2, which I'll be more than happy to take care. But for anybody who is tuning in live, then thanks for joining me and George in this conversation. It's been a pleasure to speak to you all about my views and my thoughts. And do look out for the YouTube link and for the Spotify replay if you've missed any of this. So thanks again, and apologies that it's the end of the broadcast, maybe a little bit prematurely after George had to leave. Thanks again.